Your Pharmacy Career Podcast, proudly brought to you by Ravens Recruitment, Australia's pharmacy recruitment agency, spotlights the myriad of career paths available to pharmacists. Your host, Christy Lee Patterson, and her esteemed guests will be sharing invaluable career advice that you can implement at any stage of your career journey.
Welcome everyone to another exciting episode of Your Pharmacy Career Podcast. We are thrilled to have Steve Morris, the CEO of the Pharmaceutical Society of Australia, here with us to share his insights into leadership and innovation in pharmacy. Welcome, Steve.
Yeah, thank you, Christy. Thanks for the invite.
I'd like to ask you first about your journey from completing your pharmacy degree, but then I read on your LinkedIn profile that you did some volunteering in India, and that kind of led you to the discovery of your strengths in leadership. So I'd like to understand, how these experiences influenced your career and what did you learn from that time?
Yeah, thanks, Christy. I'm happy to kind of talk about that. Look, just maybe start by saying that my career has been probably not planned or purposeful. It's largely been informed by chance, opportunity, and taking some risks. Post-graduation, my first role was in community pharmacy, and I really enjoyed that role in community pharmacy. Engaging with patients and the local community. It was fantastic role, and I really enjoyed that experience. But my first chance, I suppose, or opportunity came up when I had a chance meeting with someone who told me about an opportunity that the local Rotary Club was sponsoring something to go work overseas in India, in Calcutta, on the street clinic. And I went for the opportunity and secured it and went to work there for a period of time. Look, and it was a really enlightening experience in many ways, really, and taught me a number of valuable lessons. One of which was around how to be resilient in difficult circumstances. The second was that really small things can make a huge difference to patients in whatever context they are, whether you're destitute in Calcutta or in a different kind of challenge. And equally, that any contribution you can make is often temporary. And there was a great book I read called Legacy by James Kerr, who was writing about the All Blacks. And one of the tenets of the All Black team is that you should always try and leave the shirt in a better place. So in other words, try and make the difference you can, but whatever legacy you have is around, sustainability and difference while you've been there, because once you leave, the legacy is then sustained by others. So it's whatever contribution you make, I think it's always important to kind of reflect on that in terms of whatever contribution you make will be temporary, but try and make that difference for when you leave an organization. And remember, you often remember people, don't you, in your career, rather than particular roles. And there was one individual, particularly a leprosy patient, who was probably one of the happiest people I've ever met, despite his significant challenges as an individual. And just that small difference by taking the time to have a chat with him, largely through an interpreter, made a huge difference to him. And I think, never underestimate the small things you do which can make a difference to patients and consumers.
Now, after you were in India, I'm assuming you went back to the UK for a while. And so where did your life take you post-India?
Well, it kind of intermittently was back to the UK and back to India again. So I kind of got roles back in community pharmacy, mainly because I needed to earn some money. But really, I spent a period of time kind of yo-yoing between the UK and India in terms of the roles I was doing, because the work I was doing in India was a volunteer work. It was unpaid, which I was more than happy to do. But obviously, I'd need to also have enough resource to live. So I kind of, for a period of time, I worked between community pharmacy in the UK and in Calcutta. So I went back there numerous times, and I've kind of maintained that connection to that charity even to this day. However, at some point, I decided that maybe there were other challenges I also wanted to take up. And I was really interested then in moving into hospital pharmacy. And at first I found that quite difficult because I had no experience of working in hospitals. I was then probably 6-7 years into my pharmacy degree. So taking up opportunities was difficult. However, I think, again, it taught me that never give up on some of those things, because even though you might get knocked back 3 or 4 times for particular roles, if it's something that you really believe that you want to do, just keep going. And so I kept going until eventually I got offered a role in a hospital. And then that role kind of went from being a dispensary-based role to being, a clinical pharmacist on the wards, to taking up a wider governance role, including a role in trying to promote evidence-based medicine and guidelines within the hospital. So, yeah, it kind of evolved over a period of time. And during that period, I got a real interest at the time because it was kind of having a real kind of flow behind it. It was evidence-based medicine, or what became evidence-informed medicine. So there's a lot of kind of focus, particularly in the UK at that time, around how you enable evidence-based practice to contribute to real patient outcomes, and how you influence clinician behaviour in terms of adopting evidence-based practice into their practice, and kind of a move away from what some would describe as eminence-based medicine to evidence-based medicine. So during that period, I got really kind of into that kind of area of medicines and pharmacy, and I did a master's degree in health research and technology, and really enjoyed that kind of evolution of the role in pharmacy of influencing those kind of decisions of clinicians within an acute setting.
What you said about getting knocked back and the resilience part of it, because I think especially when I'm interviewing people such as yourself, you've had such distinguished careers, and for someone that is maybe earlier on in their career, or maybe they've had some setbacks, and it can be a bit disheartening, and I guess no one really talks about the failures or the struggles that they've had. So
Also, look, no is never no, right? There's always a possibility that you can get a yes. So you just got to keep, if that's what you want to do, you just got to keep going.
So you mentioned that you did a master's degree in health technology assessment. So why would you decide to do something like that?
Because at the time I was, as I said, focusing on evidence-based medicine. And again, I think I've done a number of masters in my career, including an MBA later on. And I think they do provide frameworks in which it kind of consolidates your own thinking. And so I was really interested then about understanding more about health services research more broadly than medicines, about the whole context and culture of evidence-based medicine. So that really helped me. And again, it's often the people you do the course with as opposed to the course itself, which kind of you make the connections. You have a much greater understanding of where other people are thinking in terms of that space. And so it's in the early days of evidence-based medicines, to be frank. So it was good to kind of get into that space and understand it from a more academic perspective.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting that you've done the MBA as well. I've definitely seen a bit of a kind of a transition to lots of pharmacists actually undergoing MBA programs or additional masters. From your perspective, being a pharmacist, it's almost that lifelong learning journey,
Yeah,
isn't it?
that's right. I don't think it ever ends, and it shouldn't, because I think once you lose the kind of appetite for learning, then you lose the appetite for the profession and your role, because we're always learning, whatever role we're doing. I'm still learning now, what could be different context you're working in. It could be new things that are coming out, whatever kind of your, I suppose, scope of practice as a pharmacist is that, we're constantly trying to pick up and learn new things. And once you lose the appetite to do that, I think, it becomes difficult. And so, be constantly motivated by those things, I think. The other thing I would say, just reflecting on things like MBAs, is my other reflection would be try not to be one of those people that does a master's like that and then talk like an MBA dictionary afterwards. Because,
Yeah.
in the end, it's
Yes.
just a framework for thinking, whether it's from strategy, risk, or whatever context of management it is. It just provides you a framework to think things through. But
Mm.
still, often common sense prevails, and the things that are really important still matter. And there's nothing worse than you sounding like an MBA dictionary to somebody else.
Yeah, great advice. I'll definitely be taking that on board. Absolutely. Yeah, how did you end up in Australia and getting a significant role, such as the executive director of SA Pharmacies?
Going back to my context of chance and opportunity. So in the UK in the early 2000s, there was a massive investment in primary care under a 10-year NHS plan at the time. And there were really opportunities for innovative roles in primary care. So I then left the hospital, took up one of those roles. And it was really about driving improvement in general practice. We evolved having practice-based pharmacists in virtually every GP practice. And just remember the context that there's pharmacist prescribing has been around in the UK for 20 years. So I was right involved right from the beginning of that kind of construct of getting pharmacists to work with general practice, evolving their skills from, I suppose, general medicines management reviews to evolving their own clinical workload, becoming supplementary prescribers. So I was part of that kind of whole journey. And again, it was just an opportunity that came up where I could see that this looks like a really interesting, fascinating place, right? Where we're evolving services. There were organisations, and I won't go into the detail because it's from a UK context, but I'll describe them as like PHNs on steroids. So basically, they had much more commissioning power, much more ability to determine what services were provided locally. So we did things like set up anticoagulation services out of community pharmacists. This was 20 years ago. COPD services out of community pharmacists, direct clinics working out of GP practice. All these things were evolving at that time. And it was a great time to be able to innovate because there was both funding and a desire to make change. So it wasn't without its challenges. So I spent maybe 5 or 6 years in that. And my first, I suppose, non-pharmacy role was then as director of primary care. So it meant that within a particular region, I was accountable for GPs, dentists, district nurses, pharmacists, all kind of health-related services, really. So it's the first time that I'd led a kind of non-pharmacy service. And the lesson I learned from that was that I started to see pharmacy through a different set of eyes, not through the eyes of a pharmacist, but the eyes of somebody who's accountable for providing all those services. So in other words, what could pharmacy do to help me with the problems that I had? Again, that's I think a valuable lesson that I've kept with me in terms of when I'm now advocating for pharmacy services, to see how other people might be viewing how you're advocating for those services, because they'll be looking at it differently, perhaps, to how you would be as a complete advocate for pharmacy and where pharmacy sits. So I think that role was the first time I kind of looked at pharmacy with a different lens, being responsible for collective of services. And then I went from that role to a national role, working for the National Prescribing Centre, and again did national work on advocacy, policy, education, supporting service delivery in that organisation. And so did quite a bit in terms, I suppose, a national profile in leading some work in medicines and pharmacy services. And it's then from there, another chance opportunity came up where it sounds odd now talking about it, but I just basically met a friend in a pub and we had a chat about somebody he knew who told him that there was a job in Adelaide as chief pharmacist. And I said to him, "Where's Adelaide?" And he said, "Well, this is what Adelaide is." I went, "Oh, that sounds interesting." So I basically put my hat in the ring, had the interview, came and looked at Adelaide, came back, discussed it with my family, and went, "Well, let's do it." Yeah, what's the worst thing that can happen? Well, the worst thing that can happen is you have to go back to the UK. So again, it wasn't purposeful. I just didn't purposely set out to come to Australia, but the opportunity came up and I just took it. It sounded like an interesting opportunity.
And how did your family, I guess, take that opportunity? Because I think this is something that maybe isn't talked about a lot, but I think having the support of your family and people around you in order to take these roles. So that would be a big shift to move your family halfway across the world.
Interesting. This seems as quite a snap decision, but I just went for the interview, came back, and we discussed it as a family. And my family have always been really supportive. My wife in particular, going, "Yeah, let's do it." And we kind of have the same lens on things that what's the worst thing can happen? Well, the worst thing that happens is it doesn't work out and you go back to the UK. And also you think about missing family and all those things and how you keep all those things connected. But it happened rather rapidly. I think another reflection would be often when people create lists of why they should do something and why they shouldn't, you probably never come to a conclusion because those two lists balance themselves out. So I think sometimes you just have to go with your gut feel and work out what's the worst outcome. And if the worst outcome is tenable, then it should be fine. So we came to Australia hoping to stay, and it was one of the best decisions I ever made. So, and that was to come over to be chief pharmacist in South Australia.
And that was the first time that role was actually created. Is that correct? You were the first chief pharmacist, or was that?
I think there'd been a previous iteration, but then there'd been a bit of a gap, I think.
Mm.
And again, it was a great opportunity for me. And I think maybe another reflection is that sometimes when you come into a job, the job doesn't have to stay as it's been described and defined when you come into it. So I come into that particular role as a kind of chief pharmacist role, which often is kind of, defined by being largely around a legislative function and policy. And fortunately, I was in a space at the time where some of the ideas I had, I suppose, coming from a different system, was to actually bring things like quality use of medicines, medicine safety, and try and address inequity into the role of the chief pharmacist. So we kind of brought all those things together, both the legislative function, the kind of quality use of medicine function, the medicine safety function, which then enabled to have more, I think anyway, on reflection, more impact in how you evolve that role. So one of the interesting things that hit me when I first came to Australia was the inequity that existed in hospitals in terms of access to medicines. So basically, whether you could access a high cost medicine largely depended on potentially which hospital you went to. In other words, there was no uniform, each had drug and therapeutic committees that might make different decisions. So one of the things that I was able to address was to make that a statewide kind of initiative. In other words, there was a statewide decision body created which made decisions around access to those medicines, but there's then uniform across the whole system, not just dependent on which hospital you went to. So the issue of inequity, I think I said to you previously, is constantly kind of been a reflection of how you might address those things. So again, one lesson was the job doesn't have to be as it was described when you first go into it. If you have thoughts, ideas, even within the bureaucracy, then you can often progress those if you make the right case and make it what you want it to be.
Great advice. I think, yeah, I could definitely see the fact that you've got that that passion for that equity.
Yeah.
That you got from your experience in India. It sounds like it's definitely something that has stuck with you throughout your roles.
And I'm just going on to the essay again. Sometimes things happen which you can't predict. So, for example, the SA Pharmacy, and for those that might not be aware of it, SA Pharmacy is a statewide pharmacy service. So basically, is accountable for all the hospital services across the whole state. And again, when I came as chief pharmacist, there was no prospect of that occurring. But after about a year and a half, I think it was a Treasury initiative at the time, which was based on cost savings, to establish a statewide service. And so at that time, I had a decision to make. Did I just stick in the chief pharmacist role, or did I put my hat in the ring for that role? Now, as happened, I put my hat in the ring for that role, secured that role, and then basically was told, well, can you just continue being chief pharmacist as well? Which is interesting, and I did, and I agreed to that. I did both roles for 4 or 5 years. And it's an interesting paradigm when you have both the policy role and also the service delivery role in the same organisation, which has its challenges, but also means that you can often transact policy into action in a much more speedier timeline. But that was a significant personal decision for me as to whether I could carry on taking both roles, because the workload was not insignificant. But I really enjoyed the role in SA Pharmacy. We transformed some of those services. Again, going back to the equity issue, we opened a number of pharmacies in rural, remote areas that had never previously had an on-site pharmacy. We did an enormous amount of work about addressing the mental health care needs of patients. Because once you had the statewide service, you could look at those things more holistically in terms of how you can establish pharmacy services to improve health outcomes, both based on particular health needs and particular demographics. And that service still exists now, so it's been going for quite a few years now. And it's, again, going back to the legacy issue, hopefully I contributed, I obviously set up the organisation and contributed to its sustainability, but others have taken on, I suppose, that role and it's doing even better, more meaningful things, and increasingly does so. So that was really satisfying, I think, being involved in setting something up from its startup, but also seeing how it's been sustained through others. The biggest personal challenge was how you deal with the workload of those two roles.
Yeah, I guess that comes from the support of your family again as well, with that extra workload that definitely would have put some extra pressure on.
Looking again, I am trying to reflect on the things I've learned through the process, and I think one lesson I learned partly through that process, I didn't look after myself as much as I should have done, and I probably didn't prioritise my family as much as I should have done. But I think if you can try and take a step back, seek to have mentors outside of your organisation. I always sought the advice of mentors in whatever role I've done. They don't have to be long-term mentorships, but they're just people you can trust to have conversations with. But I think it is easy, particularly in leadership roles, to be consumed by the role. And I suppose I've learned a few things through things I didn't do as well as I should have done on reflection.
I guess the role at SA Pharmacy, you've then moved on to roles such as at Arthritis and also the NPS Medicine Wise. I guess it sounds like they're all very different roles with
Yeah,
different responsibilities. And so if you could maybe touch on, these experiences and,
yeah. So
what did you learn?
yeah, I'll start off with MPS Medicine Wise because I went from um, after exec director of SA Pharmacy, I then took on the role of statewide services overall, which was pathology, radiology, and pharmacy. But then the opportunity came up to become CEO of MPS Medicine Wise. I was really interested in that role, partly because some of its functions related back to the National Prescribing Centre I worked for in the UK many years ago, and that kind of embeddedness of evidence-based medicine. How do you turn that into behaviour change and then ultimately patient outcomes? But the three CEO roles I've had have all been quite different. So that role came into an organisation which was largely government funded, and just before I started, they had significant budget cuts. So my role, the first role, and often when you come in as a leader or a CEO of an organisation like that, you're faced with that reality, and sometimes you have to make reasonably prompt decisions just to sustain an organisation. So in that situation, it was about how you articulate to people why you're doing what you're having to do, whilst at the same time creating some optimism for what the future could look like. And I think a lesson I learned from that was definitely, there's no such thing as over communication. You have to communicate over and over again, almost until you're bored with your own voice in terms of, decisions you're making, why you're making them, but to create optimism in the organisation. And at that time, the organisation was faced by significant cuts. And it's always difficult when staff who are staying in the organisation see their colleagues being made redundant or have roles that were removed. So during the time I was at MPS for about 3 years, I think we tried to focus on what the future might look like as an organisation, get involved in collaborative work with other organisations, and have a complete and absolute focus on consumers as the outcome of the organisation. However, as you're aware, I left MPS before it finally closed, but for that organisation, decisions were made that there are other things that could happen that could fulfil the functions of MPS Medicine Wise. Yes, but I think the legacy of MPS Medicine Wise has been sustained through obviously the fantastic work it did over many, many years, but also in terms of the individuals who are working for MPS Medicine Wise who have now secured amazing roles in other organisations and are still kind of promoting and being passionate about quality use of medicines in Australia. When I took the role, then I had to, and again, this is the intersection between career and family, isn't it? So I had to make a very difficult decision because I needed to be back in Adelaide because of one of the challenges faced by my youngest daughter. So I made a very difficult decision to leave MPS Medicine Wise when it was the organisation was obviously in a difficult position. But in the end, I took the decision that I had to come back to Adelaide to support my youngest daughter. So my intention was never to leave MPS Medicine Wise, but a situation came up where I kind of had to, and it was the right thing to do. And again, and I'm being completely honest in this chat, I should have probably made that decision 6 months earlier, but I didn't. So I came back to Adelaide, and again, chance pervaded, and a role working for a charity called Arthritis South Australia came up, and their office was 10 minutes from where I lived. So for once, my focus had to be back on family while still retaining a job as a CEO in an organisation for which I could add some value.
Yeah, it can be challenging because when you have to make that decision, and not everyone is going to know why you made that decision as well, and that can be challenging. So thank you for being so honest about that. I think that's really important.
Yeah. So then came back to Adelaide. But got the role with Arthritis South Australia, and I really loved that role. It was fantastic. And the challenge I faced there was another one of my favourite words again was sustainability. So the challenges faced were lots of small not-for-profits and that organisation had been around for 45 years, done some fantastic work to improve the health of those suffering from arthritis. But it was suffering with the potential for a sustainable pathway. How do you make the work it did sustainable from a financial point of view? And so there are a few things in there. One, I had to kind of try and refocus it back on the things it was doing to make a difference. So we managed to secure a significant amount of funding from the state government pre-election and from local PHNs. So I was able to kind of, and largely through, I had quite obviously a significant network in South Australia from previous roles. So I was able to kind of use that and refocus the organisation, bring in some resource to do more services for consumers and patients with arthritis. But I soon realised that also what was needed was a longer term sustainability pathway. And so we did a lot of review work in terms of what would those options look like. And in the end, we landed on the fact that the best option going forward was to merge with a much bigger charity. And that charity in South Australia is called the Hospital Research Foundation. So my role as CEO then was to make sure that that was based on evidence, the right decision and take the board with me. And then obviously to transact that decision. So once we've gone through that process, had to go to a membership vote because the organisation is a member organisation. It then became part of that charity, which created a sustainable pathway for it. And at that point, I'd done as much as I could. I could, I had a role working for the bigger organisation, running a number of charities, but then the opportunity to become CEO of PSA came up. So again, it wasn't planned. I was probably happy to then probably spend the rest of my career working in the not-for-profit sector outside of pharmacy. Just doing work with different charities, and we're probably sort of under the CEO role in that space. And so the CEO of PSA came up, and I reflected on it. I thought, well, in many ways, look, it's I still am a registered pharmacist. I'm still passionate about pharmacy and medicines. I've had a wider career probably than most pharmacists. So maybe this role was an accumulation of all these things together to bring together both my CEO experience, but also still my passion for pharmacy and medicines as CEO of PSA. So role came up, and I'm happy that I was successful in securing that position.
As the CEO of PSA, I think you definitely bring a unique perspective, not just as a pharmacist, but your experience across all the other healthcare sectors and the not-for-profit with that leadership experience. I think, sometimes as pharmacists and as an industry, we can be very insular. And I say that we sometimes have our blinkers on, and you've been on the other side. And I think that's important to see that, when we're advocating for things, how is that seen on the other side for consumers or other health professionals or for politicians and things like that. There has been some, I guess, chatter even around early career pharmacists about the relevancy of member organisations such as the PSA. Would you be able to tell me about what your role is as CEO of the PSA and what's the importance of these initiatives that you're leading on the focus for all pharmacists?
Yeah, look, just to hook back on the membership, I think internationally, membership as a construct has been declining over a number of years, and so I think a lot of people, particularly younger generation pharmacists, other career pharmacists, question what does membership mean, what value do I have? And I suppose, in very simple terms, it's my role as CEO of PSA to demonstrate that PSA has real value and is of meaning to every pharmacist. In terms of not only what we may be doing from a broad advocacy perspective, but really making sure that we're communicating what that means to an individual. Because I think that's, in the end, what will determine whether people decide whether they wish to be a member of PSA or not. So we have to be able to communicate why should a pharmacist be a member of PSA. Looking at, obviously, I think there are many reasons for that. And I think, what is our role? Well, if you kind of reflect on the I suppose the vision of the organisation is that what we're trying to do is optimise the role of pharmacists in the healthcare system for the benefit of consumers, and we do that by enabling, equipping, and embedding pharmacists in the Australian healthcare system. So that's what we try and do. And we try and do that by various mechanisms in terms of advocacy. How do we advocate as robustly as we can with both federal government, state governments, in terms of supporting the roles of pharmacists? And obviously, over recent year, we've seen a number of changes, particularly around scope of practice and prescribing pilots, which has been a result of that advocacy work by us and other organisations about how you start to really create that kind of momentum of change in scope of practice in real terms, not just talking about potential change, but what does it mean in terms of real terms? And I think the other element we have to be is to provide the right education and support in the ways that people want to receive it, and that could be in multiple formats. irrespective of kind of the role in pharmacy you're going to play. So if you see your role in community pharmacy, if you see your role as an accredited pharmacist, if you see your role in aged care, if you see your role in GP practice or in the hospital sector, then do we as an organisation ensure that what we offer is contemporary, fit for purpose, and meets your needs? Because look, PSA is a fairly broad church. We're representing the only government peak recognised organisation, so we represent pharmacists in many, many roles, and it's often very difficult to keep everybody happy within that broad church, because people will always say, well, why are you doing more for them than us? So you have to be your hand on heart, say, look, we're doing all we can for everybody, and make sure that you have enough in the things that you offer from an education, CPD support perspective, that people believe there's genuine value being a member of organisation. And obviously, as CEO, I firmly believe there is. And to see the impact, I suppose, after 6 months in the role now, of going from ideas to policy evolution to advocacy, and then seeing some of those things be put into practice. So even things like on-site pharmacists and aged care, which I think was announced just before Christmas that it will be executed going into the new year, then that was due to a lot of advocacy work PSA did in the previous few years. I think often it's difficult for people to appreciate what advocacy actually means and what the end point is. And so again, I think that's a role we have to really work out how we better communicate that to members and the rest of the profession.
Absolutely. I think the key is that communication. You mentioned earlier that in some of the other roles, you found that you can't really over communicate. And that's maybe something potentially that the PSA has maybe not done as well in the past. And I've been in the PSA in leadership roles in the past before. And it is challenging to kind of, you're doing all this great work, but then because it is an advocacy role, and sometimes there's things that are confidential that you can't also speak about as well, which is really challenging. So you seem like someone that would like to be open and transparent 100% of the time, but then in the political space as well, you need to be mindful of what you are communicating. And so I guess that's a challenging role as CEO to know what do you communicate and when.
Yeah. Look, you're right. I firmly believe in transparency and communicating as much as you can, but there are circumstances, and I suppose the HCPA that we're currently going into at the moment will be one example of that, where you sign NDA agreements and you can't fully communicate everything you would like to talk about. So that's obviously a line that you've got to be careful about how you define it. But I think most people respect honesty and openness. And when our membership's currently, I think 17,000 pharmacists. Of 17,000 pharmacists, it's always going to be very difficult to be able to satisfy every one of those 17,000 people. I think what I'd like to, from CEO, be able to reflect on is that we've done everything we can to support every one of those 17,000 people, irrespective of where they work. And hand on heart, we can say that we've tried to do that.
Really important. Like this is the year that we are now 10 years in from being able to be vaccinating pharmacists.
Yeah.
And now consumers just see that as a everyday thing that pharmacies can provide. But just 10 years ago, so I graduated in 2014 and was able to do vaccines in my intern year. And that was very new and very scary, but 10 years on, look at us now. And that's only through the advocacy work of organisations such as the PSA.
Yeah. You're making me feel very old now, Christy.
I'm sorry.
I graduated in 1985.
It's not old, it's experience.
I often say to people, I am not the future of pharmacy. I've said that in conferences a couple of times, which I'm not. I mean, my role is the PSA is trying to get organisation advocating for the future of pharmacy, but I'm personally not the future of pharmacy. And I think, having been around a fair amount of time, we go through flows of positivity, then flows of negativity. And I think pharmacy overall is going in the right direction. And I think the next 10 years could be really exciting, really exciting. Obviously, the number of people, particularly in the community pharmacy sector, are very anxious about what happened last year in terms of 60 days. But if you look at where the profession's going, then we all have to be optimistic. we have to be mindful, obviously, of the challenge of ensuring services are appropriately remunerated and services are sustainable. But I think from a profession point of view, I think, COVID, I think, inflated our balloon in terms of the opportunities because of vaccination. And then I think 60 days deflated it for many people, I think. And so, but the opportunity still exists. And I think you just look at how the scope of practice pilots have gone and how every state's basically come on board and what that might mean for future roles in pharmacy, then it is exciting. Not that it won't be without its challenges, but I think from a profession point of view, I think we're going beyond just talking about pharmacists doing all these things to actually these things happening and it gaining a lot of momentum in the system. And the vision for pharmacy I would have as being fully integrated into primary care, everybody working to top of scope, with a caveat that wishes to work at top of scope. Because again, I think sometimes we always think about everybody wanting to do everything, and that's where the whole profession wants to go. There's some pharmacists who probably don't. They're quite happy with the role they have now. We always have to be mindful of that. But I think the opportunity will exist for pharmacists to be much more integrated into primary care, having much more access to digital systems to be able to fully discharge the abilities that pharmacy has as the most trusted profession in Australia. Yeah. I think it goes back to what I said, that across all those 17,000 members, we should be doing something to support all of them. It may look like we're focusing on one area at a particular time, but that could be just an issue of opportunity that exists in terms of an advocacy space. But I think, at the end of the day, I hope that, hand on heart, PSA is providing a valuable contribution for people to work to the scope of practice they wish to work to as a pharmacist. But also take up some of those opportunities I've frequently talked about, because I think pharmacists should be in more leadership positions in the health system, for example. Often they're dominated by other professions. It's sometimes because pharmacists don't take up opportunities. And sometimes you have to take those opportunities which don't seem to have a direct line to evolving your career, but it's just about doing different things in different contexts, which gives you a kind of wider level of experience of health, if that's where you would like to go. But you just have to take those risks, really, because sometimes they won't lead to somewhere that will evolve your career, and sometimes they will.
Yeah, absolutely. As we wrap up our conversation, do you have any final advice or insights you'd like to share with our listeners?
Yeah, thanks, Christy. Some of this will be a repeat of what I've probably said already. I think the first thing is always focus on the patient or consumer. What difference in what you do will it have on that individual? That's the first thing. The second is professionally, don't be deterred by setbacks. Careers are never a linear progression, but take opportunities when they come up, some of which will work out, some of which won't. But try and develop some resilience in that process. Always seek advice and support from others. I'm a great believer in people taking up mentors outside of organizations you work in, just a safe place where you can have conversations about any anxieties you have or any advice you want in terms of progressing your career. But I think, be open to change, be open to opportunities, don't be deterred by risks. It's a very un-pharmacy thing, I would say, the last bit.
Yeah, that's right. It's probably not our innate ability to do that, but really great advice. Thank you so much, Steve, for joining us today and sharing your incredible journey with me and the listeners. I've certainly found it really valuable, and I've learned a lot about yourself, which, yet to be honest, I'm actually feeling really excited that you're our CEO of the PSA. I think there's so much opportunity for pharmacists in the future, and I'm feeling privileged that we have someone like you leading our organisation, which is great. So thank you, Steve, for being our guest on this episode of Your Pharmacy Career Podcast. It was an honour to have you share your wealth of knowledge and experiences with our listeners. To our listeners, we hope you have found this episode both informative and inspiring. And if you'd like to connect with Steve or learn more about the Pharmaceutical Society of Australia, please check out our episode description for relevant links and resources. Thank you, Steve.
Yeah, thanks, Christy.
You've been listening to Your Pharmacy Career Podcast, brought to you by Ravens Recruitment. Don't miss our next episode where we continue to explore the multifaceted world of pharmacy careers. Make sure to subscribe and share.